Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about chapter 2 of The Wizard Knight today. It's going to be a little bit quick here, but there's something that I wanted to talk about beforehand. Someone asked me, kind of how I read Wolfe and how I came to this particular reading. And I do want to talk about that a little bit today because I think it's very important. First off, I assume, right, that he creates these patterns and structures that point to a definitive conclusion. And so when you're reading it, you have to see, okay, what's sticking out here? What seems to be repeating? And this is a consistent pattern, I'd say, from Long Sun all the way to the time he's writing Sorcerer's House, right? It's very puzzle boxy type works. I feel like before this, even though there were examples of it, he often would let the surface text dictate a lot of mysteries, right? And I think that in this period, those mysteries are ultimately solvable with one thing, one aspect that explains so many different things. Another thing is that, and you'll see it in chapter 2 here of The Wizard Knight, that the dreams have a very particular transcendent signification. Wolfe is kind of he mixes like literal and metaphorical symbols all the time. And so there's a story that Sandra Meisel told, I believe, about how a publisher asked for a jacket shot, right? And Wolfe, went to his friend who was into like guns and said, "Hey, can I borrow your gun out on the shooting range there?" And he put his jacket on a chair and then he shot it, right? And so he actually shot his jacket and took a picture and sent that in. That's a very literal kind of mindset. But he always is invested in the multiple meanings of a word and how they can kind of combine to create something that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So a lot of the times when I see commentary on Wolfe, I feel like the commentators have confused the literal with the metaphorical, and the metaphorical with the literal, and that this is what Wolfe intended. So, for example, in chapter 2 of The Wizard Knight, which I'm going to recap in just a little bit, there actually is a part where bold Berthold says, "Dreams, not dreams." Right? He's telling us overtly and metatextually that the dreams are not dreams. And we don't pay attention to stuff like this. We're like, oh, the dreams are very real to him or something like that. No, he means it literally for the interpretation of the text. And that's early in chapter 2, right? And so we're going to delve into all those metatextual moments where Wolfe is pointing a big finger at certain things and everybody just ignores them, right? And they come up with something that is not really textual. Wolfe tries in that time period. Now, Land Across is different. He throws everything and the kitchen sink in there. But the other thing is that with these symbols, often when you're speaking with someone who hasn't read the book, you will give a summary and they will understand things very clearly. For example, in Long Sun, there are dogs called gods in the tunnel, right? And if someone overheard me talking with someone else and saying, "Oh yeah, there's gods in the tunnels," that's actually what it implies, right? There are indeed gods in the tunnels there, right? And this happens so many times in Wolfe. So with my reading of Wizard Knight, I was talking with someone about it, and I was saying, yeah, there are these chimera, right? And so there's two of them, blah, 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 blah. And the person who was listening hadn't read the book and said, "Are they chimeric twins?" And I was like, I don't think so. But then my mind, went back to the opening with Parker and the bowstring and the dreams about the pregnant woman whose child would die and all the talk that Iden had about how she was most afraid of those giants with multiple limbs, right? Like there was an extra eye or an extra head or an extra arm. And then in the Room of Lost Love, where his name was Abel because he was able to be born. And I realized that this was actually what was going on. And when I looked through the book again, at every single instance, I understood what was going on, what was implied in the subtext there. So Wolfe lays these symbols out so that when you recount the story to someone, right, like let's say Shadow Children riding Marshmen in the embedded tale of Fifth Head of Cerberus, or Gods in the Tunnels, or in Short Sun, right, where nettles get chopped off a bush, right? It implies something about literally what you could be talking about in the story there. You have a character named Marsh. You have a character named Nettle, right? Here in this one, the same thing happens. There's a moment where Wolfe says, "The chimera, he really bothered me. There's something wrong about all this, but I can't put my finger on it." we're supposed to put our finger on it, right? We're supposed to figure it out. And so chapter 2 here, we're going to start right there. But once again, one more thing that I want to talk about. I mentioned the story of Balder. In this one, bold Berthold is going to show up. And I said that Balder can mean bold. Who is Balder, right? He is the god of light, I believe the son of Odin and Frigg, right? And so with his death, right, basically events will be set in motion for, I said I would say the American pronunciations like Ragnarok, but, I think it's like Ragnarok or something like that, right? Ragnarok there is coming, and it's kind of presaged. This is one of the signs that it's going to come. It's when Balder, this god who was universally loved, dies. And how does he die in Norse mythology? It starts with a dream that he and his mother share about his death, right? And this is exactly what is happening in The Wizard Knight. This is a dream that's being shared about a death here, right? A death of a very important person. Now, there's more to that story, right? And we'll go into it a little bit. But basically, his mother goes everywhere, getting every living creature to agree not to harm her son, Balder. But because mistletoe is so innocuous, she kind of leaves it out of the deal, right? And so when he's invulnerable there and everybody is kind of throwing weapons at him and stuff, his blind brother, Hoder, winds up using a mistletoe spear, right, and killing him. And so we'll talk about his return, his possible return later. But this accidental death by a blind brother is something very important, even in the early chapters of this. So the ruined town, let's look at chapter 2 here. So in this one, Abel plants his seed, right? He's overseen by this older knight that has a black dragon on a green shield there. And then he meets with some people, 2 fishermen, and then another pair of children who try to rob him. And then he actually winds up with bold Berthold there, who tells him about the giants kind of attacking his town, right? So that's in brief the story. He's finally going to meet up with bold Berthold here, and his brother, ostensibly, who recognizes him as Abel. But we're going to look at a few more textual indications here. So he's planting the seed after he's awoken by the sun, right? He feels the warmth there, and he also notices that he's involved with other lives from the bowstring that Parka has given him, right? It felt good to be away from the sound of other people's voices and all the work and worry of other people's lives, the things the string kept telling me about. So he's away from those lives. That really is a connection to America, basically, to the real world there. So he's hungry and thirsty, and he drinks and drinks, and then there's a broken fountain, and he plants this seed from the spiny orange, one of the 3. We're going to talk about the 3 seeds a little bit later, probably not today, okay? And so this person, this knight, this older knight looking at him, in the surface story, is the older version of himself looking at him to make sure he's securely in McArthur. Right? So he began to fade as soon as I saw him. And in a couple of seconds, the wind blew away what was left. It was a long time before I found out who he was. I'm not going to say anything about that here, but I do want to say something else, and it will go here as well as anywhere. That world is called McArthur. I did not learn it till later, but there's no reason you should not know it now. Parka's cave was not completely there, but between McArthur and Alfreece. So basically, between the land of the Mossmen and, the Fey elf there like Desiree and the Fire elf like Uri and Baki, between those 2 levels there, right? Parka's cave, and then there's McArthur. So he's kind of in between them. And so I'm going to talk about my scheme for these 7 lands later and why they're different than the 9 of Norse mythology, just a bit because they're biological, right? So Mossmen, they mean something biologically. Right? The fire elves that drink blood and then are used later on to provide blood to others. They are something biologically, right? And so if there's levels to this, when he plants a seed, he's in the higher level there in McArthur. Okay, and so basically he says that, hey, this guy was watching me to make sure that I was securely there, right? And so this is also a metaphor for the way that the text is working. It's all happening after, and it's like looking back on it, right, this ghostly figure is looking back on what's already happened. It's a metaphor for that, both the dream that's sent after the baby's dead and for the surface text where, okay, right, this has already happened. I'm writing a letter about it. And so this is him looking back on it kind of from out of his own point of view and perspective, right? And so there, he winds up on Bluestone Island. And now here we're going to talk about something else. The letter conglomerations, right? There are patterns with the letters, and it's important that B, right, is kind of looked at because bold is there, right? Eventually, we're going to get Ben as well that he's talking to. So we have Bluestone Island here, which is kind of where he winds up. So we need to think of characters not just as people, but also kind of as locations as well, right? Because Duke Indine with an I was the lord of this Bluestone Castle here. Indine means unworthy, right? And so these names are also going to be important. And so there, he's looking at the island there, right? There's cliffs that are not so steep. He's starting to eat. He eats some mussels there. The sun's overhead. And then he sees two fishermen, okay? And so this pattern of two is going to be repeated throughout this chapter and much, much throughout the book as well. Right? So they see him and he goes with them and they offer him a choice of fish that they catch together. I told the young one, not a lot older than me, that I would take it and share with his family if his wife could cook it. And so that not a lot older than me is important because Abel is supposed to be a little kid here. And yet already they're talking about the wife of this guy who's not a lot older. Right? And so we'll talk about twinship and doubling and all this stuff coming up here, but they take the fish there and they tell ghost stories, right? After dinner, we told stories. When it was my turn, I said, I've never seen a ghost unless what I saw today was one. And it's his ghost, right? Even though, he's going to show up later in the surface text, but it is his ghost. So I'll tell you about that, even if it won't scare anybody, like the ghost in Scar's story. Now, it's Scaur, but it still means exactly the same thing. Something that's trying to heal, right? And so we have the ruined town here, right? And we're going to learn about bold Berthold Scar as well. So this S character, like Sexneat and Svan, right? And Schildstar, the giant who kind of invades. Those are important. So B and S, when he's at Bluestone Castle, he runs into these S characters, Scar and Shah, two of them, right? And so he's talking to them, and he's telling them the story about the rocky island, and that's where he learned that it belonged to Duke Indine. And now later on, right, we're going to have Iden, right? And so she is going to be in a very important position for his life. Right? And so we'll deal with that a little bit later, but it's important to line up all of these letters here. And he says, I spent the night in the garden because I had something to do there, a seed I had to plant. You see, somebody important had told me to plant a seed. I hadn't known what she meant until I found seeds in here. And so Shah's grandfather, so we learn that the younger one is Shah here, tells him, you chop down a spiny orange. S and O, let's keep that in mind, even though we talked about this as the Osage orange tree last time, right? You cut a spiny orange, you got to plant 3 seeds. If you don't, the Mossmen will get you. So the Mossmen are something like the fairy that are associated with fecundity, right? And so we'll talk about this a little bit later too here. So the grandfather spits in the fire and he says, you know what? There's hardly any spiny oranges left, but it's the best wood that there is. He tries to have Scar break the bow that Abel has from that, and he can't do it, right? Scar tried. He was strong and bent my bow nearly double, but it did not break. And so the grandfather says it can't be broken. Now, this is something that we'll talk about later. We're going to come back to this. There's not but one fruit on a spiny orange most times, and not but 3 seeds in it. They'll chop down the tree. You got to plant them in 3 places, else the Mossmen will come for you. And Shah said, go on, Abel. Tell us about the ghost. And so he tells him he decided to plant the first seed there in the garden of Bluestone Castle. So the first seed is planted in a place with a B, right? And we're going to keep belaboring this point. He puts it in the stone bowl there, right? And he takes the water from that stone bowl, scoops it up, and then he plants it. Okay, and he decides to drink what was left there. He digs a little hole, and then he sees that night there, so he repeats it. And then he learns that, you know what, from Scar, Duke Endine's badge, once again, bees, was the blue boar. So it wasn't him, right? It was somebody else there with the dragon, the black dragon on the green shield. Okay. And then he says he turned into a sort of cloud and disappeared. And Shah's grandfather says, clouds are the breath of the lady. And we're going to come back to the importance of the breath of the lady, who is the Valfather's youngest daughter. But I mean, who could that be, right? Is that Frigg? We'll talk about this a little bit more once those figures start to appear more regularly. But Shah says, don't you know her name can't be spoken? So he's trying to get to Griffinsford from there. And Scar says, you know what? There's no town of that name. Now, here is where the G names start coming up, right? And so throughout the text, we've got like Garsig and Garvon, right? And Gilling and Griffinsford and Grengarm, the dragon and the griffin. And so all of those things are also, and Gilf, those are all going to be something, right? That we're going to kind of codify and talk about. And mythologically, the death of Gilling is going to be important as well, but we're not going to deal with that quite yet because it involves two brothers killing Gilling in a boat. And that's going to be significant to this story as well. All right, so he's like, where are we? And they say Earring's Mouth. So there's the I figure coming up again. Okay, and he says, I think there's someone where I used to live there. It's a big city, but you know what? I'm kind of confused. Scar says, Griffinsford's on the griffin. And in his dreams, Abel's going to be swallowed by a griffin. So we're just going to kind of pass through this until that shows up. But basically, Scar says, there's a stream that flows into our river. Go south till you come to the river. Take the river road and you'll find it. These streams that Abel is following are also important for his dreams and for the overarching plot. So he heads out with some fish there, and he's going along near the stream, right, hanging in the shadows near the pools of rainwater. And then two boys older than I was said they were going to rob me. One had a staff, the other one an arrow ready at the knock. And so he manages to kind of fool them by giving them the bow, taking it back, beating them up more or less, and they run off. Now, there's two of them. But this image of two is going to be repeated in a second. One of them had a staff, one of them had a bow. When he comes to Bold Berthold in a second, Bold Berthold is going to open the door with a cudgel, and Abel himself is going to have a bow. Now, one of the kids there, right, was Tug, who's going to become a prominent character later. And if you look into something like Wizard Knight Companion by Andre Driussi, right? When you read the entry for Tug, you'll realize, quite correctly, he has surmised that Tug's meaning is a form of like the ability to do something, right? Like you can do it, right? And so Tug's name also means Abel. And so in this scene, right, these guys were trying to rob him, okay? And then he winds up beating them off for a second. But he's immediately going to replicate the basic weapons that they had in the next scene when he comes upon Bold, and suddenly he has the bow at the knock, and Bold has basically the cudgel or staff that you could hit something with. And now he manages to shoot a grouse there, and this bird is also going to be important because when he knocks on Bold's door, he says, hey, I'm a fat grouse, basically. Right? I'm going to share my bird for your fire. So he's willing to share the food, this bird, for warmth. When he finally tells Arthur toward the end that basically, okay, you need to reassess the way you're worshiping, the way you're doing things. You're focusing on the wrong things. At the feast there's a whole bunch of birds, and they're all like filled inside each other. Like there's a swan, and inside the swan is like another bird, right? And then the chicken, and it's all like it's stuffed inside each other. 7 birds that way. And this is also a metaphor for these 7 layers as well of McArthur. And so him sharing the food there, later on this is going to become a little bit important because that struggle between Tug and his friend with the staff there, right? With Abel, that is the fight, more or less, between brothers, right? But then when he comes here with the bird to share, Bold welcomes him into the tent, right? And they start to share as brothers should, right? And Bold has a beard, right? And he's blind. And he says, there's nothing here to steal. Says, hey, I haven't come to rob you, only to roast my grouse. I shot and plucked it this morning. I had no fire to cook it, and I'm starved. And so he says, well, come on in then, right? Save a piece for me. And Abel offers more than just a piece there, right? And so he asks, how do I get to Griffinsford? And Bold says, the curse of it. That was my village, stripling. Sometimes I go there still to see it. Nobody lives in Griffinsford these days. And then he says, no, my brother and me do. And the bearded man says, nobody at all. Nobody's left. And then Abel realizes it's not Griffinsford. Is it just the Griffin or Griffinsburg or something like that? And we're going to see the image of the Griffin in the dream a little bit later. So we'll come back to that, right? And so he says, in that city, right, Bold says, they looked up to me in that village. Some wanted to run, but I said, no, stay and fight. I said, if there's too many giants, we'll run. We got to try their mettle first. I'd noticed the word giants, a G type letter, right, and wondered what might come next. And Bold continues, Schildstar was their leader. I had my father's tall house in those days, not like this. A big house with a half-loft under the high roof and little rooms behind the big one. A big stone fireplace, too, and a table big enough to feed my friends. And so Schildstar, right, that S character there, is basically invading. And Bold actually says, right, Schildstar wasn't my friend, but he could have got into my house. Inside, he'd have had to stand like I do now. And so there's this weird parallel where Schildstar is invading the house and they would be standing in the same way, right? So this S character here, think of it in line with those other S's and what's going to happen in pairs as well with the G and the S there. All right. And so you fought for him? I, for my house, my fields in Gerda, another G, something that he's fighting for, right? The girl there, Gerda. I fought. They'll half run when they saw them coming down the road. Killed one with my spear and two with my axe. They fall like trees, stripling, right? And then he says that he's kind of been hit by a stone and his head is imaged. So scar, right, also implies the scarring that Bold has there, right? Something struck me, a stone, I don't know, put your hand here, right? And so Abel feels it and jerks back. And then Bold says, tormented after. Water and fire. It's what they like best. Took us to a pond and built fires all around it. Drove us into the water like cattle. Threw brands at us till we drowned. All but me. What's your name, stripling? And here, as he's recounting the story of going into the pond, he learns the name, right? Abel. He says, Abel? That was my brother's name years and years ago. So the pond imagery is paralleled with him learning who Abel is. And then he said, right, I found a water rat's hole. Duck and dig, come up to breathe. The brands burning and hissing. Lost count of the duckins and burns. Didn't drown. Got my head up into the water rat's house. Breathed in there. Waited till the anger born. Thought we was all dead and went away. So there's the A again appearing here. I nodded, feeling like I had seen it. Of course he's seen it, right? Tried to climb out, Bold says, but my shadow slipped. Fell back into the pond, still there. And then he says, dreams, not dreams. In that pond still, and the brands whizzing at me, trying to climb out, slippery, and fire in my face. And so, right, the shadow that he loses is actually where Abel is kind of born. He drops off here as the twin. The body of the land of McArthur is composed of the dead giant body, Imar, right? And his name means twin. And so the two figures, the two S figures, Shah and Scar, the fishermen, the two fishermen, right, that he found there. And then the two boys that tried to rob him, and then the two of them there. This is a pattern that's being repeated throughout this particular chapter. And so the Angerborn attack, right, his town of Griffinsford, and all of a sudden his shadow, the S, slips off from him, right? And so we'll talk about this more a little bit later. Now, not every chapter is going to be this way, but this chapter, it's a pattern recognition there where these things are happening. If I slept here tonight, I suggested, I could wake you if you had a bad dream. Schildster, the bearded man muttered. Tall as a tree, Schildster, his skin like snow, eyes like an owl. All right, now let's guess if Bold is thinking of Schildstar as a kind of enemy, right? What might be assaulted in the next sentence? Might it be someone who starts with a B? Seen him pick up balding and rip his arms off. Could show you where. You really going to Griffinsford, Abel? Yes, I'll go tomorrow if they'll tell me the way. Go to, the bearded man promised. Haven't been this year. Used to go all the time. Used to live there, right? And so he says, hey, yeah, sure. That'll be great. Okay. And then, my brother will have been mad at me, I'm pretty sure. He'll be over that by now. So he's talking about Ben. But Bold says, no. Bold Berthold's never worried about you, brother. You're no bandit. And so we're going to talk about the implication of the bandits soon as well. So we're just going to end these last two paragraphs here, and I'll say a few more words and end this video here. That was how I started living with Bold Berthold. He was sort of crazy, and sometimes he fell down. He was as brave as any man I've ever known, and there was not one mean bone in his body. I tried to take care of him and help him, and he tried to take care of me and teach me. I owed him a lot for years, Ben, but in the end I was able to pay him back, and that might have been the best thing I ever did. How did he pay him back? By returning what was lost in the pond to him, and then declaring, right, I'm not able at the end there. Sometimes I wonder if that was not why Parka told me I was able. All this was on the northern reaches of Celadon. I ought to say that somewhere. And we'll talk about Celadon and the structure of the seven worlds next time. But basically here, there's the surface plot where not very much is happening. And then there's patterns and motifs. And Bold actually told us, dreams, not dreams. When those dreams start to show up, we'll be able to anticipate what they are. They're going to be about not breathing. They're going to be about swimming with fish. They're going to be about pregnant women and their children who can't live. And Bold has told us, as Wolfe tends to do, that these dreams are not merely dreams. This is actually a Jungian pattern that repeats over and over and conceals what actually, right, the palimpsest there. Not all of Wolfe's fiction is like that, but in this particular period, as I think I've already said, he wrote of soil and climate and was very interested in those kind of archetypes, right, and working with them. So, as you can see, we'll be able to start guessing when things happen, whether that be with letter conglomerations, whether that be with, hey, these two are going to fight over food here, because the sharing of the grouse was very important. This is a fight over resources, and we're going to be able to see that every time he's in a position when he's fighting one other person who should be his friend, who should be his brother, right? They should be sharing, but there's something inimical about that. And Tug is going to become his ally as well, but he tried to beat him in this unknown, right? We didn't know it was Tug yet, but we're going to run into him soon. And so Tug is already attacked there. And then immediately that we saw the reverse of that, where he offers the food to Bold. So we're going to stop right here. I will try to get up chapter 3 much more quickly than this. I apologize. Please, if you have any comments or questions, I'm not always going to harp so heavily on the symbolic overlay, but these early chapters always lend themselves extremely heavily to that. So I hope you guys have a good week until we have a chance to speak again through the comments or otherwise.